Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's Halloween Havoc 1996. Starting off the evening, go to our first match of the night. It is Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Dean Malenko for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. I thought this was a great match. Back and forth matchup between Mysterio and Malenko, with Mysterio hitting a Hurricane Rana on Malenko. Mysterio then hits a dropkick on Malenko, sending Malenko to the outside. Malenko then gets up, is working on the leg of Rey Mysterio. Malenko then was keeping the pace of the match, but Rey hits a springboard senton on Malenko. But Malenko ultimately hits a powerbomb off the top rope, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time, new WCW Cruiserweight Champion, is Dean Malenko. Hats off to Dean Malenko for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Battle Bowl ring. It is Eddie Guerrero versus DDP. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Guerrero and DDP, with Guerrero keeping the pace of the match. Guerrero and DDP both exchange in the middle of the ring, with DDP hitting a flapjack on Guerrero in the middle of the ring. DDP then hits a powerbomb on Guerrero, and then DDP ultimately hits his signature diamond cutter on Eddie Guerrero, pins him for the 3. And your winner of the match is DDP. Hats off to DDP for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW United States Championship. It is Jeff Jarrett versus the Giant. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Jeff Jarrett and the Giant, with the Giant keeping the pace of the match. Jeff Jarrett then applies a figure 4 leg lock on the Giant on the outside. Flair then attacks Giant ringside. And your winner of the match, due to disqualification, is the Giant. Hats off to the Giant for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Syxx versus Chris Jericho. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Syxx and Chris Jericho, with Jericho keeping the pace of the match. Syxx then hits a senton on Jericho on the outside. Syxx then lands a kick combination on Jericho. Syxx then hits a step-up enziguri on Jericho as well. Jericho then hits a lion salt on Syxx, but Syxx hits a spin kick on Jericho, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Syxx. Hats off to Syxx for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Lex Luger versus Arn Anderson. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Luger and Anderson, with Lex hitting a press slam on Anderson. Lex then also hits a power slam on Anderson in the middle of the ring, with Lex keeping the pace of the match. Arn then hits a devastating spine buster on Lex in the middle of the ring, but Lex Luger ultimately applies his signature torture rack on Arn Anderson, and your winner of the match by submission is Lex Luger. Hats off to Lex Luger for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a tag team matchup. It is the Faces of Fear versus Steve McMichael and Chris Benoit. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with the Faces of Fear keeping the pace of the match. Benoit ends up hitting a Northern Light suplex. Ming then unloads strikes on McMichael. Barbarian then hits an overhead suplex off the top rope on Benoit. McMichael then hits Ming with the briefcase, and Benoit then hits a diving headbutt, pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Steve McMichael and Chris Benoit. Hats off to Steve McMichael and Chris Benoit for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is the Outsiders, Nash and Hall versus Harlem Heat. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Hall unloading strikes on Booker T in the corner. Harlem Heat then was keeping the pace of the match, though, with Nash hitting a sidewalk slam on Stevie Ray. Hall then hits a choke slam on Stevie Ray as well. Hall then hits a fall-away slam. Booker T then hits a Harlem hangover on Scott Hall. Nash then hits Stevie Ray with the cane from Colonel Parker. Hall then goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match, and at that time, new WCW Tag Team Champions, are Hall and Nash. Hats off to Hall and Nash for getting the win in that match and at that time becoming the new WCW Tag Team Champions. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Halloween Havoc 1996. It is the Macho Man Randy Savage versus Hollywood Hulk Hogan for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Savage and Hogan, with Savage keeping the pace of the match. Giant comes down to the ring and attacks Randy Savage. He ends up hitting a choke slam on Randy. Giant then throws Randy into the ring. Hogan ultimately goes for the cover, pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and at that time still WCW World Heavyweight Champion, is Hollywood Hogan. Couple of things I'm going to say about Halloween Havoc 1996, man, before I get out of here. Number one, this was a decent event. I'm not sitting here saying it was the best, but I'm not going to sit here and lie to y'all and say it was the worst. Personally, I was always a big fan of the Halloween Havoc pay-per-views, man. I just thought it was a cool gimmick pay-per-view. And again, I'm not really big on gimmick matches, but some of the gimmick pay-per-views from WCW back in the day were pretty cool, especially Halloween Havoc. And not only that, I mean, some of the matches on this card were halfway decent. Number one, and I've stated this multiple times, the opening match for Halloween Havoc 1996 was Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Dean Malenko for the Cruiserweight Championship. Like I told y'all many a times, man, the Cruiserweight division was severely underrated for WCW. Hands down. I mean, I mentioned a numerous amount of times, you know, the amount of names that came through that door for WCW as a Cruiserweight. You know, names like Rey Mysterio Jr., Dean Malenko, Psychosis, Juventud Guerrera, Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho. That's just to name a few, man, that came through the door of WCW as a Cruiserweight. The Cruiserweight division was severely underrated for WCW. Severely. I mean, future Hall of Famers. I mean, the Cruiserweight division was probably one of the best things WCW had to offer, in my honest opinion. Then we get Eddie Guerrero versus Diamond Dallas Page. It was a decent match, man. I mean, honestly, Guerrero went on to have a better career for himself in WWE, but for what it's worth, man, I think Guerrero's career in WCW was not that bad. Really. To me personally, and maybe this is me being biased because I was a Guerrero fan growing up, but I think Eddie Guerrero could have been multi-time World Heavyweight Champion for WCW. Hands down. I mean, he had the athletics, the charisma. I mean, Eddie Guerrero was an absolute legend and one of the best in-ring technical wrestlers that you could find and luchadors that you could find in all professional wrestling, even at that time. So, I mean, to me, and again, not trying to be biased, I think Eddie Guerrero could have been multi-time World Heavyweight Champion for WCW, in my honest opinion. But Jeff Jarrett versus the Giant, y'all know how I feel about Jeff Jarrett, man. I will say this. I think Jeff Jarrett's career, as far as in-ring career, was probably better suited in Impact Wrestling. I mean, I think his WCW run was okay. Wasn't the greatest, but I think his best in-ring career that he had was in Impact Wrestling. In this match, Jeff Jarrett did pick up the win. Giant ended up getting the victory in this match due to a disqualification from the attack by Ric Flair. We also get Syxx versus Chris Jericho, a.k.a. X-Pac, for Syxx. I think this was Syxx's first pay-per-view match for WCW, if I'm not mistaken, since he joined, I guess, the NWO, if you will. Unfortunately for Syxx, I think he was one of the, as far as, looking at NWO and the roster that NWO had, or the members that NWO had, I think you got to put Syxx at the bottom of the barrel, man. I think Syxx or X-Pac, I think X-Pac was, or Sean Waltman was better fit for Degeneration X, personally. I think NWO had no idea what to do with Sean Waltman at that time. I really don't think that. And I'm not taking anything away from Sean Waltman. I think he's a really good wrestler. I just think at that time, creatively, Eric Bischoff and, the writing staff for WCW really had no idea what to do with a guy like Sean Waltman. And I can say the same thing for, Bret Hart when he came into WCW. I mean, Eric Bischoff and the writing team for WCW had literally no idea what to do with one of the best wrestlers, if not the best wrestler of all time, on their roster. They had no idea what to do with Bret. So, it was great to see X-Pac in the ring, or Syxx, or Sean Waltman against Chris Jericho. Again, it shows you how stacked that Cruiserweight division was for WCW. And then we also get Lex Luger versus Arn Anderson. This was a solid match, man, to be honest with you. And, for what it's worth, if someone had to ask me, do you think Lex Luger's a WWF guy or WCW guy? I totally 100% believe that Lex Luger was a WCW guy for multiple reasons. Lex Luger, when he got into the business or, got really a big name for himself, he was in WCW. He was a rookie coming into the mid 80s, early 80s, mid 80s, and really making a name for himself. Had a really great matches with Ric Flair. And, he was really, one of the top draws for WCW at that time. He really was. And when he went over to WWE, it wasn't the same. I mean, he came out in WCW as, the narcissist, which I still believe is one of Lex Luger's greatest characters of all time. Especially, Bobby Heenan introducing the narcissist Lex Luger. I thought it was great. And that was one of the characters that was severely underrated, in my honest opinion. But, when Lex was going up against Yokozuna, and I don't know if you guys remember that or not, and they had the Lex Express where he would travel across the country and then finally, face off with Yokozuna, I believe, at SummerSlam. He showed up at the USS Intrepid and body slammed Yokozuna. You look at documentaries about Lex Luger on, the Lex Express, and he was just miserable, man. He didn't want to be there. He didn't want to be a team player. He just didn't want to be in the building. He didn't want to work for Vince. He didn't want to be with WWE. No. In WCW, there was a whole different side of Lex Luger. Now, I'm not saying Lex Luger is one of those guys that kept his nose clean, but what I'm saying to you is, as far as where he wanted to be, as far as being an in-ring, wrestler and everything else like that, I think it was more suitable for him to be in WCW. Whether it was working under the Crockett's or whether it was working under Ted Turner in WCW and Eric Bischoff, I think Lex was better suited to be with WCW. So to me, Lex Luger is and will always will be a WCW guy, hands down. So, but all in all, the match between Lex and Arn was a decent match. The Faces of Fear versus McMichael and Benoit, man, it was a solid match, really. I mean, the Faces of Fear are, to me, one of those underrated tag teams, man. When you got Barbarian and Ming, a.k.a. Haku, teaming up as a tag team, man, that is a force to be reckoned with right there. No doubt. I mean, Haku was a powerhouse as well as Barbarian. And, Benoit and McMichael got the victory in this match. But after the match, Benoit and McMichael really got tuned up by, Conan and the Dungeon of Doom and the Faces of Fear, man. I mean, McMichael and Benoit really got tuned up after that match. It was pretty bad. Hall and Nash, I mean, what more can I say, man? Those guys changed the business forever. Hands down. I mean, from the times that they were the Clique, whether it was, Razor Ramon and Diesel and Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Shawn Michaels and 1-2-3 Kid to, Nash and Hall joining Hulk Hogan and forming the NWO, which will forever be one of those historic moments in professional wrestling for, the rest of our lives. I mean, those guys changed the business, hands down. Hands down. Harlem Heat, again, one of those tag teams, to me, underrated. I think, Booker T and Stevie Ray, solid tag team. Obviously Booker went on to do his own thing, and I think Booker T had a great singles run, man. I really did. 5-time world champion. He had a really decent career, okay career in WWE. But, I mean, obviously he benefited out of them splitting up than Stevie Ray did. But Harlem Heat's severely underrated, great tag team, and honestly, this was a great tag team matchup between the Outsiders and Harlem Heat, man. It was a solid match with Hall and Nash becoming victorious at that time and becoming the new WCW Tag Team Champions. And then we get the main event. Two rivals, the Mega Powers collide, Randy Savage and Hollywood Hogan. This was a solid main event too, man. And honestly, what I really appreciated about this was that, when they had, I think this was at the MGM Grand Garden Arena. And Randy Savage at that time had a really big sponsor with Slim Jim. I think everybody remembers Randy Savage being, the sponsor guy or the big name for Slim Jim. And, the entire arena and the ring post and everything was really being promoted by Slim Jim and as well as Savage. I mean, Savage came down to the ring with the Slim Jims and he had the monster truck that was Slim Jim and Macho Man Randy Savage and stuff like that on the monster truck. And it was really heavily promoted by Slim Jim. So I thought that was kind of cool, man. A little nostalgia because everybody remembers that, the whole commercial with, Randy Savage and the Slim Jims and how, popular Slim Jims got after, Randy Savage did that commercial. It was just cool, man. I remember as a kid, you go to the store, you see that commercial on TV and it's Randy Savage talking about Slim Jims. It was awesome. Absolutely awesome, man. And it was a solid event. I'm not going to say it was the best Halloween Havoc I've ever seen, but it damn sure was not the worst. If I had to give Halloween Havoc 1996 a solid rating from 1 out of 10, I'm going to have to give it a solid 6, 6.5 at best, man. But this is my review of Halloween Havoc's 1996. I hope you guys are out there staying safe, be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.